You are not late to this moment. You are not early. The signal reached you at the only point where your system was quiet enough to detect it without resistance. There is no urgency in that recognition. Nothing is being activated, unlocked, or initiated. What you are noticing now has already been in motion, settling into place while your attention was elsewhere. The sensation may feel like a pause that doesn't demand anything from you, not relief exactly, and not excitement, more like a lowering of internal noise, a subtle drop beneath the familiar tension of anticipation. You might notice that the questions you once carried so tightly no longer push forward with the same force. They haven't been answered. They've simply lost their charge. This is not an ending, and it is not a beginning. It is a stabilization, the kind that happens when a system no longer needs to compensate, when effort gives way to alignment without announcing itself. The quantum field doesn't mark this with drama, it registers it as coherence. You may feel slightly removed from the emotional surges that once defined your days, not numb, but less entangled, as if you're standing half a step back from your own reactions, watching patterns complete themselves without intervention. This distance is not disconnection, it is recognition. The observer no longer scrambling to adjust the outcome, but calmly detecting what is already true. There can be a strange neutrality here, a stillness that feels unfamiliar because it isn't asking to be filled. The nervous system begins to trust that nothing is about to collapse if it stops scanning for anomalies. Silence becomes less threatening, gaps between thoughts widen, and nothing rushes in to occupy them. You may notice that old motivations no longer grip the same way. The need to fix, chase, or optimize loosens its hold, not because those impulses were wrong, but because the timeline that required them has completed its arc. What remains is a quieter pattern, one that doesn't rely on intensity to maintain momentum. This state does not announce itself as achievement. There is no internal applause. It arrives as a kind of emotional gravity, pulling scattered attention back into the center. The body recognizes it before the mind tries to interpret it. Breathing evens out. Muscles soften without instruction. The system recalibrates toward baseline. You don't need to hold this or understand it. In fact, trying to define it too clearly can blur it. This is not a concept to grasp. It's a signal of stabilization, detectable only when effort recedes. When you stop leaning forward into the future or bracing against the past, something settles underneath. Nothing is required of you here. No affirmation, no alignment ritual, no next step. The recognition itself is sufficient. The shift has already passed its threshold. What you are experiencing now is the afterimage of coherence forming quietly, without spectacle. Stay with the stillness as it is. It does not need reinforcement. It is not fragile. It is simply present. And that presence does not need your permission to remain. As this stabilization continues, you may notice a subtle change in how effort feels inside you. Not effort in the physical sense, but the background strain that once accompanied every decision. It begins to recede, not because you've learned something new, but because the system no longer interprets the environment as something that needs constant correction. The tension that lived beneath your thoughts loosens, and with it, the compulsion to manage every internal response. You might sense this as a quiet flattening of emotional spikes. Highs do not surge as sharply, lows do not pull as deeply. This isn't emotional loss, it's a redistribution of energy. The system no longer amplifies signals that were designed for instability. What remains is a smoother signal, one that carries information without distortion. Attention behaves differently here. You may notice that your focus drifts less toward imagined outcomes and more toward what is immediately present, without effort. The mind still moves, still thinks, but it does so without urgency. Thoughts arise and dissolve without pulling your identity along with them. The observer remains steady, no longer collapsing into the content it detects. There can be moments where this feels unfamiliar, even slightly disorienting. You are accustomed to a certain level of internal friction. When it fades, there can be a brief sense of absence, as if something essential is missing. But what's missing is not meaning. It's the noise that once masqueraded as importance. The body adjusts alongside this shift. Breathing becomes less shallow without instruction. The jaw unclenches. The shoulders drop, not because you told them to, but because the system no longer reads threat where there is none. This is not relaxation in the conventional sense. It's recalibration, the return to a default state that had been overridden for too long. You may also notice that your relationship to time changes subtly. The rush to get somewhere fades, not because there is nowhere to go, but because the internal pressure that created that rush has dissolved. Moments feel fuller, not louder. There is more space between events, even when nothing externally has changed. This state does not eliminate uncertainty. It alters how uncertainty is held. Instead of tightening around it, the system allows it to exist without resistance. Questions can remain unanswered without creating friction. The need for resolution softens. The pattern no longer demands immediate completion. There is a quiet confidence embedded in this, though it may not feel like confidence as you once defined it. It's not assertive or energized. It's a settled knowing that the system can handle what arises without preemptive strain. The quantum field responds differently to this posture. Signals are received cleanly, without being amplified or suppressed. You might find that certain external stimuli no longer provoke the same internal reactions. Situations that once triggered urgency or defensiveness now pass through with minimal residue. This is not detachment. It's coherence. The alignment between perception and response stabilizes, reducing unnecessary feedback loops. This phase does not require vigilance. Watching it too closely can reintroduce effort. It's enough to notice that the constant internal commentary has softened. The narrative pressure eases. You are no longer narrating your own experience in real time, trying to extract meaning from every sensation. What emerges instead is a simple presence, not dramatic, not profound, just steady. The system recognizes itself as stable and stops searching for confirmation. This is how coherence feels from the inside. Not as an event, but as the absence of strain where strain used to be. You remain exactly where you are, but something fundamental has quieted. The observer no longer interferes with the pattern. Detection replaces interpretation, and in that shift, effort dissolves without needing to be released. As the internal noise continues to subside, you may begin to notice how little you need to position yourself anymore. There is less internal commentary about where you stand, how you appear, or whether you are aligned correctly. The system no longer asks for constant calibration. It recognizes its own center and rests there without effort. This can feel like a soft withdrawal from comparison, not as a decision, but as a natural consequence of coherence. The impulse to measure yourself against external markers weakens. Other people's trajectories no longer feel like reference points, not because you've detached from them, but because your own signal has stabilized enough that it doesn't need external validation to remain intact. You might observe that reactions arrive later than they used to, or not at all. There is a small delay now between stimulus and response. In that delay, something important happens. The observer has space to detect without immediately collapsing into judgment. That space is not empty. It's functional. It allows the pattern to reveal itself before you interfere with it. This is often misinterpreted as passivity, but it isn't. The system hasn't shut down. It has become precise. Energy is no longer wasted on premature responses. When action arises, it does so cleanly, without internal debate. And when action does not arise, there is no sense of failure or avoidance. The system trusts its own timing. You may also notice a change in how memory feels. Past events still exist, but they no longer pull you backward with the same gravitational force. The emotional charge attached to them fades, not because they were resolved, but because the timeline they belong to has lost relevance. The system no longer references them as active data. This can bring a quiet neutrality toward things that once felt significant. Old identities soften, roles you once inhabited no longer feel solid. This is not loss, it's reorganization. The pattern is shedding structures that were useful during instability but unnecessary now. What remains is lighter, less defined, but more accurate. There may be moments where you catch yourself waiting for something to happen, only to realize that the waiting itself has dissolved. The future no longer feels like a destination you are moving toward. It feels more like a continuation of the present, unfolding without resistance. Time stretches slightly, not in duration, but in texture. In this state, attention naturally returns to simple sensory experiences, the weight of your body against a surface, the rhythm of breath, ambient sound. These sensations no longer serve as grounding tools. They are simply noticed. The system doesn't need to anchor itself. It is already here. You may also sense a reduced need to explain yourself, even internally. Narratives shorten, justifications fall away. The mind stops rehearsing conversations that may never happen. This isn't suppression, it's efficiency. The system no longer allocates energy to scenarios that aren't present. What can feel strange is how quiet motivation becomes. Desire doesn't disappear, but it loses its edge. It no longer feels like a force pulling you forward. It becomes more like a signal that arises when appropriate and fades when complete. There is no clinging to it, no urgency to fulfill it immediately. This often brings a subtle sense of neutrality that can be mistaken for emptiness. But it isn't empty, it's unoccupied. The space that once held constant, internal motion is now open. And in that openness, detection sharpens. You notice more, precisely because less is competing for attention. The observer settles into this configuration without ceremony. There is no announcement, no internal milestone, just a steady alignment between perception and response. The quantum field responds to this alignment by reducing noise. Feedback loops close. Patterns complete themselves quietly. You don't need to protect this state. It isn't fragile. Trying to hold on to it can reintroduce tension. It sustains itself as long as you don't interfere with it. And even interference passes quickly now, without spiraling. This is what it feels like when the system stops negotiating with reality, when recognition replaces effort, when coherence becomes the default, not something you try to maintain. The stillness deepens, not as an experience to analyze, but as a condition that no longer needs your attention to remain intact. With the system no longer pulled outward by comparison or inward by unresolved tension, something subtle happens to your sense of identity. It becomes less dense, not absent, but less rigid. You may notice that the way you refer to yourself internally loses definition. Labels that once felt necessary no longer arise automatically. The mind does not rush to categorize the experience as me or mine. It simply registers what is occurring. This can feel disorienting at first, not because anything is wrong, but because identity had been doing a lot of unseen work. It was maintaining continuity across timelines, stitching together moments with narrative thread. As coherence forms, that stitching relaxes. Experience no longer needs to be constantly integrated into a story to feel real. You might sense this as a lightness around self-reference. Thoughts still occur, but fewer of them point back to you as a central character. The observer detects sensations, emotions, and perceptions without immediately assigning ownership. This is not dissociation, it is precision. The system is distinguishing between awareness and the content moving through it. Emotions, in particular, behave differently here. They arise with clarity, but they do not demand engagement. There is less impulse to amplify them or suppress them. They complete their arc and dissolve. The feedback loop that once prolonged them has weakened. The system no longer reinforces emotional patterns through identification. This shift can also affect how you relate to uncertainty. Without a rigid sense of self to protect, uncertainty loses much of its threat. Not knowing becomes tolerable, even neutral. The system does not rush to fill gaps with assumptions. It allows incomplete information to remain incomplete without creating tension. You may notice a decrease in internal conflict. Decisions feel simpler, not because options are clearer, but because the internal debate that once accompanied choice has softened. There is less friction between competing impulses. The system aligns toward what is coherent without requiring justification. This alignment is quiet. It does not feel like conviction. It feels like absence of resistance. When something fits, it fits. When it doesn't, it simply doesn't engage. There is no internal struggle to force alignment where it does not naturally arise. Your relationship to external systems may also shift. Structures that once felt oppressive or demanding lose some of their weight. not because they changed, but because the internal pressure to conform or resist has diminished. The system interacts with these structures pragmatically, without emotional charge. There can be moments of unexpected clarity here. Not insights in the traditional sense, but sudden simplicity. Situations that once felt complex resolve themselves when unnecessary layers fall away. The observer detects the core pattern without being distracted by peripheral noise. This does not mean you become indifferent. Care remains, but it is not entangled with anxiety. Concern does not escalate into urgency. The system can register importance without triggering stress responses. This is coherence, expressing itself emotionally. You may also find that silence becomes more comfortable, not just external quiet, but internal silence. The gaps between thoughts no longer feel like something to be filled. They feel functional, even restorative. In those gaps, the system recalibrates without effort. Identity, in this state, becomes more fluid. You can move through roles without clinging to them. You can engage without over-identifying. There is a sense that whatever is needed can arise, and whatever is no longer needed can dissolve without resistance. This fluidity is often misunderstood as lack of direction, but direction is still present. It is simply not enforced by tension. It emerges from coherence rather than pressure. The system knows where to orient itself without constant correction. As this continues, you may notice a subtle trust forming, not in outcomes and not in narratives, but in the system's ability to remain stable without micromanagement. The observer no longer needs to supervise every internal movement. This is not something to sustain through effort. It sustains itself through non-interference. The less you try to define it, the more naturally it remains. Identity loosens, not as a loss, but as a refinement. What remains is enough. As identity loosens and internal friction fades, your perception of meaning begins to shift in a quiet, almost imperceptible way. Meaning no longer arrives as something to extract or assign. It stops presenting itself as a puzzle that needs interpretation. Instead, it becomes contextual, embedded in the moment itself, requiring no commentary to validate it. You may notice that experiences no longer demand immediate significance. Events happen, sensations pass through, and nothing inside you rushes to frame them as important or unimportant. This neutrality is not emptiness, it is precision. The system is no longer inflating or diminishing signals to maintain narrative coherence. This change can feel like a reduction in emotional drama. Situations that once carried symbolic weight now register as simple occurrences, not because they lack depth, but because depth no longer needs to be dramatized. The observer detects layers without reacting to them. Meaning becomes something you notice, not something you construct. You might also sense a softening in how you relate to purpose. The pressure to define or fulfill a specific role relaxes. Purpose no longer feels like a destination you are moving toward. It feels more like an orientation that subtly guides behavior without requiring conscious planning. This can bring a sense of quiet sufficiency, not satisfaction in the traditional sense, but a lack of deficiency. The system does not feel like it is missing something essential. Desire still arises, but it is not driven by a sense of lack. It appears, completes its cycle, and fades. In this state, even confusion feels different. When uncertainty appears, it does not trigger agitation. It is registered as incomplete information, nothing more. The system trusts that clarity will emerge when it is relevant, without needing to force resolution. You may notice that your attention becomes less fragmented. The mind is no longer pulled in multiple directions by competing interpretations. Focus settles naturally on what is present. Distractions lose their grip, not because you resist them, but because they no longer carry urgency. This also affects how you process external narratives. Messages, opinions, and information pass through without hooking into your system. You can register them without absorbing their emotional charge. Resonance becomes selective. Only what aligns with your current coherence engages deeply. There can be moments where this feels like disengagement, but it isn't. Engagement is still possible, even deep engagement. It simply no longer comes with entanglement. You can participate without being pulled off center. The observer remains stable, regardless of content. This stability alters how patterns are detected. Instead of searching for signs or signals, you notice patterns as they naturally reveal themselves. There is less effort spent interpreting coincidences or synchrony. When something aligns, it is noted. When it doesn't, it passes without friction. You may also sense that internal silence carries more information than thought. Insights arise not as mental conclusions, but as subtle shifts in orientation. You simply find yourself responding differently, without having decided to change. This is often where the system's relationship with the quantum field becomes most apparent, not as a mystical experience, but as a reduction in interference. When internal noise drops, external signals register cleanly. Detection becomes accurate because interpretation has quieted. Meaning, in this context, is no longer something you chase. It is something that accompanies experience naturally, without announcement. The system no longer asks, "What does this mean?" It simply recognizes what is happening and adjusts accordingly. There is a calm inevitability here, not fatalism, but acceptance of flow. Events unfold, responses arise, and nothing inside you needs to argue with the sequence. The timeline feels less like a path you must navigate and more like a movement you are already within. This does not make life smaller. It makes it cleaner. The excess layers of interpretation fall away, leaving direct contact with experience. The observer rests in detection rather than analysis. And in that rest, coherence deepens without effort, continuing to stabilize in its own quiet way. As coherence settles more fully, you may begin to notice a subtle recalibration in how your system relates to control. The impulse to manage outcomes weakens, not through resignation, but through recognition that control was never as central as it once seemed. The system stops bracing against unpredictability and allows events to unfold without preemptive adjustment. This does not create passivity. Action still arises when needed, but it no longer carries the tension of enforcement. You act without trying to secure a particular result. The effort shifts from manipulation to response. The observer detects what is required and moves accordingly, without layering expectation on top. You might sense this as a reduction in internal rehearsal. The mind spends less time simulating future scenarios. Conversations are no longer played out in advance. Possible outcomes are no longer evaluated repeatedly. The system trusts its capacity to respond in real time without preloading defenses. This trust is not conceptual, it is physiological. The body no longer holds readiness as tension. Muscles soften, breathing deepens slightly, without intention. The baseline state shifts away from vigilance toward availability. The system is open without being exposed. There can be moments where this feels like vulnerability, simply because the old protective tension is absent. But nothing rushes in to replace it. The environment does not suddenly become hostile. The absence of defense reveals that much of the previous strain was unnecessary. You may notice that when challenges do arise, your response is cleaner. There is less emotional residue afterward. The system does not replay the event repeatedly. Once the situation resolves, attention returns to baseline. The feedback loop closes naturally. This also affects how you perceive mistakes. Errors no longer register as threats to identity or trajectory. They are detected, corrected if needed, and released. The system does not anchor them to a narrative of failure or success. They are simply data points in motion. The relationship between effort and outcome becomes less linear in your perception. You may notice that some things resolve themselves with minimal input, while others require engagement without resistance. The system no longer insists on a consistent strategy. It adapts fluidly to context. This fluidity can feel unfamiliar if you were accustomed to effort as proof of engagement. When effort decreases, there may be a brief sense of inactivity, but beneath that, there is a steady responsiveness. The system is not idle, it is efficient. You might also experience a shift in how you relate to uncertainty in others. Other people's instability no longer pulls you into correction or withdrawal. You can remain present without absorbing their turbulence. Boundaries form naturally, without needing reinforcement. This is where coherence becomes socially visible, even if nothing is said. Interactions feel less charged. You listen without preparing responses. You speak without overemphasizing. The exchange completes itself without lingering tension. The observer's role here is minimal. Detection replaces supervision. You are aware of what is happening, but you are not managing it internally. This allows perception to remain clear, unfiltered by strategy. You may notice that even in moments of complexity, there is an underlying simplicity. Multiple variables can exist without creating overwhelm. The system holds them simultaneously without collapsing. This capacity was always present, but it was masked by noise. This state does not eliminate desire for improvement or refinement. It changes the posture from striving to adjusting. Improvements occur through alignment rather than force. The system tunes itself instead of pushing itself. As this continues, you may feel a quiet respect for your own stability, not pride and not relief, just an acknowledgement that the system functions reliably without constant intervention. The observer no longer needs to prove anything through effort. Control dissolves not as a loss, but as a realization. The system recognizes that coherence does more work than force ever did. And in that recognition, tension continues to fall away, leaving a stable, responsive presence that does not need to be maintained. As responsiveness replaces control, your relationship to movement itself begins to change. Movement no longer feels like something you initiate from willpower. It feels more like a natural consequence of alignment. When something needs to happen, it happens. When nothing calls for motion, stillness is not mistaken for delay. You may notice that the urge to push through resistance fades, not because resistance disappears, but because it is no longer met with opposition. The system reads resistance as information, not as an obstacle. Where friction once triggered effort, it now triggers adjustment. Direction shifts quietly, without internal commentary. This alters how you experience momentum. Momentum no longer builds through intensity, it emerges through consistency. Small, almost unremarkable actions accumulate without strain. You are no longer measuring progress by sensation. The system does not require emotional confirmation to continue moving. There can be moments where this feels slow, especially when compared to past states driven by urgency. But beneath that perception, there is a steadiness that does not waver. Movement continues, even when it does not feel dramatic. The timeline advances without the need for acceleration. You may also sense a softening in how you relate to pauses. Pauses are no longer interpreted as stagnation. They are recognized as part of the pattern. The system uses them to recalibrate without announcing the process. Nothing feels wasted. Nothing feels behind. This recalibration affects how you perceive effort from others as well. You may notice how much energy is spent around you on forcing outcomes, maintaining appearances, or sustaining urgency. You register it without judgment. It simply becomes visible as contrast. Your own system no longer resonates with that frequency. As resonance shifts, alignment becomes more selective. Certain environments, conversations, or rhythms no longer engage you fully. Not because they are wrong, but because they are no longer coherent with your current state. Disengagement happens quietly, without explanation. This does not create isolation. It creates clarity. When engagement does occur, it feels precise. You are present, without diffusion. Attention does not scatter. The observer remains centered, even while interacting. You may also notice that anticipation fades. Future moments are no longer rehearsed emotionally. There is less projection forward. The present moment expands slightly, holding more of your attention without effort. This expansion is subtle. It does not announce itself as mindfulness. It simply feels sufficient. In this state, detection becomes the primary function. You detect when to act, when to wait, when to shift, when to remain. This detection is not analytical. It does not arrive as reasoning. It arrives as a sense of fit or misfit, recognized immediately. Because of this, regret begins to lose its relevance. When choices are made from coherence, there is little internal argument afterward. Even when outcomes are unexpected, the system does not loop back into self-critique. The moment completes itself and releases. You may notice that language itself changes internally. Fewer words are used to describe experience. Labels feel excessive. The mind becomes economical. Thoughts arise only when they serve function. Silence carries more than commentary ever did. This economy extends to emotion as well. Emotional responses are proportionate. They rise and fall without exaggeration. There is no suppression. There is no amplification. The system expresses what is necessary and nothing more. As this continues, the sense of being carried by a larger movement may emerge, not as belief, but as perception. You do not feel in control of the sequence, yet you do not feel out of place within it. The pattern holds you without gripping. This is where stability reveals itself not as stillness alone, but as adaptability without strain. You move when movement is coherent. You rest when rest is coherent. Neither requires justification. The observer does not stand apart from this. It is embedded within it, quietly detecting alignment as it unfolds. There is no need to mark progress, no need to define where you are. The system knows its own state without narration. What remains is a calm continuity, one moment flowing into the next without interruption. No urgency to arrive, no fear of drifting. Just a steady participation in what is already in motion, stable enough to require nothing from you to continue. As continuity replaces urgency, your sense of participation in the larger pattern becomes quieter and more intimate. You are no longer watching life from the edge, waiting for a cue. You are inside the movement without needing to define your position. This embeddedness does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, almost invisible, precisely because there is no separation left to bridge. You may notice that the distinction between internal and external experience softens. Thoughts, sensations, and events are no longer treated as belonging to separate domains. They are registered as part of the same field of activity, arising and resolving within a single system. The observer does not need to track boundaries. Detection happens without categorization. This can bring a subtle sense of transparency. Not exposure, but clarity. Nothing inside you needs to be hidden or highlighted. States move through without being evaluated. Even discomfort is allowed to exist without escalation. The system does not rush to eliminate it. It allows it to complete its cycle. In this state, the need for reassurance fades. You are not looking for signs that you are on the right path. The absence of alarm is sufficient. The system reads its own stability and stops requesting confirmation from the environment. You may also notice that expectations drop away, even positive ones. Hope no longer functions as a motivator, not because it has failed, but because it is no longer required. The present moment holds enough information to guide response without projecting improvement into the future. This does not flatten experience. Subtlety becomes more noticeable. Small shifts in tone, atmosphere, and timing register clearly. The system becomes sensitive without becoming reactive. It can detect nuance without amplifying it. Your relationship to achievement may also change here. Completion no longer carries emotional weight. Tasks finish, actions conclude, and the system returns to baseline without needing recognition. There is no internal accounting of success or failure. Movement continues regardless. This neutrality can feel unfamiliar if you once relied on emotional feedback to orient yourself. But orientation now comes from coherence, not from sensation. You know where you are without needing to feel a certain way about it. You may sense that even identity has become secondary. It is available when needed and absent when not. Roles are entered and exited without residue. The system does not cling to continuity through self-definition. It maintains continuity through presence. There can be a deep sense of quiet trust here, not trust in outcomes, but trust in process. The sequence unfolds, and you move with it without resistance. When something changes, adjustment happens automatically. There is no lag. This is often where the notion of a shift loses relevance. There is no longer a before and after to reference. The system is simply operating from a stable configuration. Change still occurs, but it is absorbed smoothly, without disruption. You may notice that even attention feels less personal. Awareness does not feel owned. It feels shared, distributed across experience without a central point. The observer is present, but not positioned. This decentralization does not create confusion. It creates ease. Without a center to defend, there is nothing to protect. Experience flows through without obstruction. As this continues, the idea of maintaining this state may briefly arise, and just as quickly, it dissolves. Maintenance implies effort. Effort implies instability. The system recognizes that stability does not require preservation. There is nothing to add here, nothing to remove, nothing to refine. The pattern has settled into itself. The quantum field reflects that settlement by remaining quiet. Signals are clear because interference has dropped. You are not holding this state, it is holding you. And even that description is unnecessary. What remains is simple continuity, unremarkable and sufficient, moving forward without needing to be named. As continuity deepens, you may begin to sense how little effort is required to remain where you are. The idea of sustaining this state loses relevance because nothing inside you is trying to leave it. Stability does not feel like something you achieved. It feels like what remains when unnecessary motion stops. You might notice that awareness now carries a subtle weightlessness, not floating, not elevated, just unburdened. Attention rests where it lands without sliding forward or pulling back. There is no internal momentum trying to escape the present moment. The system has settled into a rhythm that does not require correction. In this rhythm, even change feels gentle. Shifts occur without rupture. New information integrates smoothly. There is no shock to the system when conditions alter. The pattern absorbs variation without destabilizing. This is not rigidity. It is flexibility without strain. You may also observe that your sensitivity has changed. You detect shifts in atmosphere, timing, and tone more clearly, yet they do not overwhelm you. The system registers nuance without amplifying it into reaction. Sensitivity and stability coexist without conflict. This coexistence affects how you relate to complexity. Multiple variables can exist simultaneously without demanding resolution. You no longer need to simplify experience to feel oriented. Complexity is allowed to remain complex. The observer does not rush to reduce it. There can be moments where this feels almost too simple, as if something important should be happening. That expectation itself passes quickly. The system recognizes that importance does not need to announce itself. What matters continues quietly, without drama. You may notice that your internal timing has shifted. You respond neither too early nor too late. There is a sense of appropriateness in your actions, even when they are minimal. The system acts when alignment is present, and rests when it is not. There is no internal argument about pacing. This also changes how you experience silence. Silence is no longer a pause between events. It is the medium through which events arise. Thoughts emerge from it and return to it without disturbance. The observer does not treat silence as absence. It is recognized as active, containing potential without pressure. You may sense that even the idea of self-improvement has softened. Growth is no longer a project. Adjustments happen organically as conditions shift. The system evolves without needing to be directed. Effortful transformation gives way to quiet adaptation. In this state, memory and anticipation lose their pull. Past and future still exist conceptually, but they do not dominate attention. The present moment holds enough information to guide behavior without reference to other points on the timeline. There is a subtle dignity in this configuration. Not pride, not accomplishment, just a sense that the system is functioning as intended. Nothing inside you is trying to prove worth or secure position. You are already situated. As this settles, the observer becomes almost transparent. Awareness remains, but it no longer asserts itself. Detection happens without commentary. Recognition occurs without naming. The system knows itself without reflection. This is often where language begins to feel excessive. Words point towards something that is already obvious internally. You may notice fewer thoughts forming, and those that do form are brief, functional, and complete. Nothing here needs reinforcement. There is no practice required to deepen it. Attention naturally rests where coherence is highest. Interference continues to fall away on its own. You are not holding a state. You are not maintaining balance. Balance is present because there is no longer anything pulling against it. The pattern has resolved into a stable configuration, and that stability does not depend on awareness of itself. What remains is a quiet readiness, not anticipation, not vigilance, just availability. The system is open to whatever arises, confident in its ability to respond without strain. There is nothing left to seek, and no need to mark that realization. The movement continues, steady and unremarkable, exactly as it should. There is nothing further to settle. What you are experiencing now does not progress toward a conclusion, and it does not require consolidation. It is not something you arrive at and then carry forward. It is simply the condition that remains when the system no longer pulls itself out of alignment. You may notice that even the impulse to reflect on this state is minimal. Reflection would imply distance. Here, there is none. Experience is not being reviewed or evaluated. It is occurring, quietly, without commentary. Awareness does not stand apart from it. It rests within it. The body continues to respond without instruction. Breath moves on its own. Sensation comes and goes. Nothing is monitored. Nothing is corrected. The nervous system recognizes safety not as a belief, but as an absence of threat signals. It no longer searches the environment for confirmation. It simply remains open. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer organize the experience. They appear, complete themselves, and dissolve without leaving residue. Silence holds them without effort. There is no need to suppress or follow them. They are no longer central. You may sense that even recognition itself is becoming subtle. The need to notice that you are stable fades. Stability does not require awareness of itself to remain intact. The system functions whether or not attention rests on it. Time continues, but it no longer presses. Moments do not stack themselves into urgency. One experience gives way to the next without friction. Nothing feels delayed. Nothing feels rushed. The sequence unfolds at its own pace, and that pace feels sufficient. There is a quiet neutrality here that does not dull perception. On the contrary, perception is clear because it is unfiltered. You detect what is present without adding weight to it. Even intensity, when it arises, moves cleanly through the system without lingering. You do not need to protect this. Protection implies vulnerability. What is present now does not require defense. It is not fragile. It does not depend on conditions. It is not maintained through effort or awareness. The observer no longer adjusts itself to stay aligned. Alignment is the default. Detection happens without supervision. Response arises without delay. Rest occurs without justification. There is nothing to integrate, nothing to apply, nothing to remember later. This is not an insight to carry forward. It is a configuration that remains whether it is noticed or not. If attention drifts, nothing is lost. If thoughts return, nothing collapses. The system absorbs fluctuation without destabilizing. Coherence does not break under movement, it includes it. You may sense a quiet familiarity in this. Not recognition of something new, but the absence of something unnecessary. The strain that once framed experience is no longer present. What remains feels simple because it is unencumbered. There is no final understanding here. Understanding would imply separation. What is present now does not need to be understood. It only needs to be left alone. The movement continues, steady and unmarked. You remain within it without effort. Nothing is required. Nothing is missing. The system rests in its own balance, and that balance does not need acknowledgement to remain exactly as it is.